Ted Bundy actually worked at a suicide prevention hotline. I really want you to just let that sink in for a second. The colleagues who sat right next to him, who worked the phones with him night after night, they described him as charming, intelligent, and deeply compassionate. He literally saved lives over the phone. Welcome to This Explainer. You know, the absolute most disturbing thing about serial killers isn't that they're inhuman monsters. It's that they're not. They're people. People with childhoods, with totally normal fears, and with the chilling ability to smile right at you. So today, we're diving straight into the forbidden psychology of serial killers. Look, popular culture desperately wants, and frankly needs, these killers to be literal monsters, right? Creatures fundamentally different from the rest of us. It makes us feel safe. But understanding exactly how an ordinary, everyday mind becomes capable of extraordinary evil is one of the most important and, most forbidden questions in psychology. The terrifying reality we have to face is that they are seemingly ordinary people. Think of this explainer like opening a highly classified FBI file, the anatomy of a monster. We're going to page through this archive together to uncover how a completely normal mind transforms into a vessel for unimaginable acts. Science tells a very, very different, much darker story than the movies do. And to truly understand it, we have to look past all the Hollywood sensationalism and stare directly at the psychological architecture of evil. FBI profiler John Douglas, the guy who basically pioneered modern criminal profiling, spent decades sitting across the table from convicted serial killers, just analyzing their minds. And his conclusion was deeply uncomfortable. He said, these were not aliens. They were the product of recognizable psychological processes. They are forged by trauma, by abandonment, deep humiliation, and the slow, incredibly methodical erosion of the psychological boundaries that keep you and me from acting on our darkest impulses. Well, to understand this erosion, we have to go back to the beginning. Way back in 1963, psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald identified what's known as the MacDonald Triad. It's basically 3 childhood behaviors that popped up with striking frequency in the histories of violent offenders. We're talking persistent bedwetting far beyond an age where it's developmentally normal, cruelty to animals, and obsessive fire starting. Now, later research has shown these aren't like strict guaranteed causes, but what they point toward is absolutely crucial. These behaviors signal a deep internal rage and a profound sense of powerlessness. Violence begins as a desperate fantasy of control in a child's life that feels completely, utterly out of control. And where does that severe powerlessness even come from? Severe childhood trauma. This is a reality that's rarely discussed in mainstream true crime. We're talking physical abuse, sexual abuse, extreme emotional neglect, witnessing horrific violence, or just being raised by caregivers who were themselves profoundly damaged. Now, I want to speak directly to you right now. This does not excuse what they did. Absolutely not. Millions of people survive horrific childhoods without ever harming a single soul. But it does explain the psychological architecture. It explains the distorted attachment and that chilling dissociation from the humanity of others that makes the unthinkable possible. We can actually see this lack of empathy physically. Think about a normal brain, your brain. You have an active prefrontal cortex, which handles impulse control and moral reasoning, and an active amygdala to process fear and empathy. But in a killer's brain, neuroimaging shows dramatically reduced activity in these exact regions. Look, when you see someone in pain, something in your own brain hurts too. You feel vicarious distress. It's the biological brake that stops you from harming others. But for these men, that empathetic circuit is simply dead. They literally do not experience fear or empathy the way you do. So if there's no empathy there, what fills the void? Well, the fantasy is the rehearsal, the crime is the performance. Almost universally, serial killers describe having this elaborate, secret fantasy life that developed years, sometimes even decades, before their first physical crime. Most people never know this part. These horrors are rehearsed in the mind over and over and over again. They're fantasies of control, of domination and power over those who had humiliated or harmed them. And eventually, those fantasies just become increasingly consuming, and eventually insufficient as a substitute for real action. The path to violence follows a very distinct, horrifying progression. First, severe trauma leads to profound powerlessness. That breeds the elaborate fantasy, which is the rehearsal. And finally, the violent crime, the performance. Notice the gap between the fantasy and the crime, though. Between the very first fantasy and the very first physical crime, there's almost always a long window. A vast stretch of time where intervention was completely possible, but simply missed. Let's apply this psychology to the actual case files. First up, Ted Bundy. In public, he wore a flawless, charming mask. He was handsome, highly articulate, and, as we noted right at the beginning, compassionate enough to work a suicide hotline. But in private, he described his killings as the acting out of an uncontrollable compulsion that had been building inside his mind since he was just a teenager. He actually understood, intellectually, that what he did was wrong. He just couldn't stop. Then you've got Jeffrey Dahmer. To his neighbors, he was just the quiet, polite guy next door. But his private reality was deeply, deeply disturbed. It started with that childhood cruelty to animals we mentioned earlier, a deep, morbid fascination with the insides of living things. His horrific crimes were, in his own words, a desperate attempt to create companions who could never leave him. It was an ultimate, twisted assertion of total control. And finally, the case of Dennis Rader, known as BTK, the ultimate family man, a church president, a Boy Scout leader. He was quite literally a pillar of his community. Yet he lived a horrific double life for decades, authoring these taunting letters to the police describing the murders he'd committed and the ones he still planned to carry out. 3 entirely different men, 3 very different pathologies, but one chilling common thread, a childhood that produced a mind that just could not find another way to feel powerful. It's the terrifying reality that real monsters hide in plain sight. The psychology of serial killers is not comfortable knowledge. I know. It forces you to look deep into the abyss, to ask questions you'd probably rather not ask about neglect and about what exactly happens when a child's suffering goes invisible for way too long. Not to excuse, not to forgive, but to understand. We have to dive into this dark psychology because honestly, understanding is the absolute only weapon we have to prevent it. Which leaves us with a final, pretty chilling question. If these patterns are as recognizable as science says they are, how many ordinary-looking people are out there right now silently living in the fantasy stage? I want to thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you've got the nerve to uncover more forbidden psychology and buried history, make sure you subscribe to Dark Archive. Every single week, we open a new file to reveal the dark truths they definitely never taught you in school. The archive is open.